General Hospital will reveal from the very first moment Tracy stepped onto the crimson carpet of the nurses' ball, a storm of tension rippled through Port Charles. Clad in an elegant gown that shimmered under the lights and with her perfectly coiffed hair sculpted like a crown of resilience, she stood as a living embodiment of legacy and indomitable power. Her heels clicked purposefully against the floor as she approached the podium, lifting the microphone with an air of authority only decades of commanding a room could cultivate. She didn't hesitate, her voice unwavering as she began to address the crowd with her impassioned call to action, Bien Fap Si, a bold and uncompromising measure aimed at eradicating crime and violence from the streets of Port Charles. Her eyes swept the audience, filled with a conviction that made even her fiercest critics pause. But before her declaration could reach its peak, the unmistakable sound of urgent footsteps echoed through the grand ballroom, cutting through the applause and commanding attention like a thunderclap on a clear day. The interruption wasn't subtle. Harrison Chase emerged from the shadows of the velvet-lined entryway, his expression solemn, his posture unmistakably that of law enforcement on official business. He wasn't there as a guest, or even as a man concerned. He was there to execute justice, and that justice had a name, Tracy. Without preamble, he walked up to the podium, gently but firmly requesting that she accompany him outside. The silence in the room was deafening. Cameras rolled, guests whispered, and the orchestra, sensing something seismic, fell quiet. Tracy blinked, momentarily stunned. A flicker of confusion, then indignation, crossed her face, but she did not collapse. With the composure of a woman long acquainted with scandal and survival, she stared Chase in the eye, unmoved. But when the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists and the red carpet she once owned became her walk of shame, the world collectively gasped. This was not just a disruption, it was a rupture in the very fabric of the event, a scandal destined to eclipse every gown, every performance, every whispered affair that had ever graced the nurses' ball. As Tracy was led away, the lights still dazzling and the crowd still reeling, Drew watched from across the room, his lips curled into a smile that bordered on sinister. There was no sympathy in his gaze, no hint of regret. He stood not as a victim, but as a man who believed he had orchestrated the perfect downfall. Beneath the public facade he'd carefully cultivated, a man who had survived betrayal and imprisonment, lay the truth: Drew was no pawn, but a puppeteer. He had constructed this elaborate web of deceit with precision, threading every strand to lead back to Tracy. What no one saw was how he had coerced Portia into obtaining the ketamine used to set her up. He had cornered her with threats of exposure, professional and personal, and left her with little choice but to comply. In public, Portia appeared conflicted but loyal. In private, she was suffocating under the weight of secrets that could destroy her life. Drew had written her role in this tragedy, and she had no option but to perform it. From Drew's perspective, everything was in place. Brad, ever opportunistic, had accepted Drew's financial offer to provide critical intel linking Portia to the ketamine. Every detail was calculated. The arrest was meant to be the climax of Drew's vengeance against Tracy, a culmination of years of tension, rivalry, and unresolved animosity. He stood confident, certain that this public humiliation would mark the end of Tracy's reign. But Drew's greatest weakness was his arrogance, his belief that he could anticipate every variable. He had underestimated one crucial thing: Tracy's intuition. Tracy had smelled the trap long before the handcuffs clicked. Something about Drew's obsession with the ketamine incident rang false. His eagerness to control the narrative, to push her into a corner, felt too rehearsed. She didn't panic. She planned. Quietly and without fanfare, she reached out to Isaiah, a seasoned private investigator whose loyalty had been tested and proven in past storms. Isaiah, discreet and meticulous, began peeling back the layers of Drew's machinations. He started with Brad, tracing the funds Drew had funneled through shadow accounts and shell companies. The financial breadcrumbs led him to a name almost forgotten: Bard. Bard had once been Drew's associate, entangled in a previous scandal that had left him scarred and bitter. When Drew abandoned him to face the consequences alone, Bard disappeared. But not without keeping receipts. Isaiah tracked him down, a recluse nursing old grudges and nursing an arsenal of damning evidence. It wasn't difficult to convince Bard to return, he had been waiting for this opportunity. Armed with documents, audio recordings, and transaction histories, Bard re-entered Port Charles as Tracy's secret weapon. The timing was surgical. As the media frenzied over Tracy's arrest, Bard surfaced like a ghost from Drew's forgotten sins. Tracy might have been in handcuffs, but Bard held the keys to her vindication. He didn't go to the police. He went to the press. Within hours, a flood of reports began circulating. The same reporters who had broadcast Tracy's downfall now aired Bard's exposé, Drew's blackmail of Portia, his manipulation of Brad, his orchestration of the entire drugging setup. Screens lit up across the city with grainy audio of Drew threatening Portia, spreadsheets showing diverted hospital ketamine inventory, and a damning email thread that traced every move back to him. Portia, seeing her chance for redemption, stepped forward with her own confession. No longer under the shadow of coercion, she corroborated Bard's account and provided additional proof. With the walls collapsing, Drew's facade crumbled. His expression shifted from smug certainty to stunned disbelief. He had built a narrative, a spectacle meant to ruin Tracy, and now it was unraveling with every passing minute. What he hadn't anticipated was that his own allies would turn against him. Brad, ever the survivor, began cooperating with authorities. Nina, sensing the storm brewing, grew increasingly nervous. Her involvement in manipulating Jacinda to drug Drew was still a secret, but secrets in Port Charles rarely stay buried. Back at the police station, Tracy was uncuffed in silence. No press release, no apology, just quiet acknowledgement that a mistake, no, an injustice, had been made. She didn't gloat. She didn't rant. She simply walked out with her head high, every step a message that she was far from broken. The nurses' ball had been intended as her political stage, her moment of influence, and though the spotlight had briefly turned against her, she now owned the story. Drew, once again, faced the prospect of prison, but this time with no sympathy, no scapegoat, no redemption arc in sight. The city buzzed with betrayal, headlines screamed about the scandal, and Port Charles was left shaken. The nurses' ball, long a night of glamour and celebration, had become a battlefield. Alliances shifted. Reputations shattered. And in the middle of it all stood Tracy, unflinching, underestimated, and ultimately undefeated. Drew had tried to orchestrate her destruction. Instead, he had scripted his own. And now, the real reckoning was only just beginning. Moments after Tracy was escorted out in handcuffs, the news of her arrest spread across Port Charles like wildfire. It didn't take long for social media to ignite with grainy clips and stunned reactions, turning what should have been a night of celebration into a public relations nightmare. The glitz and glamour of the nurses' ball abruptly collided with scandal, and the red carpet became the scene of whispered speculation and frenzied reporters scrambling for details. But while the public's attention remained fixed on the spectacle of Tracy's downfall, something far more critical was unfolding behind the scenes, an orchestrated counterstrike that had been quietly brewing beneath the surface. Outside the grand venue, Cody happened to cross paths with Molly, who was lingering uncertainly near the entrance. Her family hadn't returned her calls, and the tension in the air left her visibly unsettled. Cody, ever the charming distraction, offered her his arm, and together they stepped onto the red carpet. For a brief moment, their playful banter and light chemistry provided a small reprieve from the tension threatening to swallow the event whole. But while they posed for photographers and laughed under the glow of flashbulbs, chaos was quietly shifting into focus just out of frame. In a dimly lit hallway not far from the main ballroom, Isaiah handed Bard a manila envelope bursting with documents, recordings, and financial statements, irrefutable evidence of Drew's treachery. Each sheet of paper and digital file was a puzzle piece in a grand design Drew had crafted to eliminate Tracy, a plan that had already begun unraveling from the inside. Isaiah, meticulous in his investigation, had traced every thread of Drew's manipulation. The threats issued to Portia, the payments funneled through dummy corporations to Brad, the stolen ketamine records, and, most damningly, Drew's own communications that laid bare his intentions. Bard didn't hesitate. This wasn't an act of moral righteousness, it was vengeance. Years earlier, Drew had used him as a disposable pawn in a separate scandal, promising loyalty, then abandoning him to take the fall when things went south. The betrayal had cut deep, leaving Bard to vanish from Port Charles with a silent vow of retribution. Now, thanks to Isaiah and Tracy's quiet determination, that promise had come full circle. Bard would not just strike back, he would do it in front of the entire city. As Drew reveled in what he believed was his triumph, mingling with guests, smirking as whispers of Tracy's arrest grew louder, Bard made his move. He strode confidently into the media tent just outside the main ballroom and requested a live broadcast interview. The stunned producers, sensing a breaking story, immediately patched him in. Within seconds, Bard was on screen, speaking not just to Port Charles but to the entire world. Calm and collected, he began reading from the documents, displaying damning pages on the camera one by one. Each word landed like a gavel strike, methodical, sharp, impossible to ignore. Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere shifted palpably. Laughter died mid-sentence. Conversations were silenced. All eyes turned to the large monitors that now projected Bard's face and voice. Drew, frozen mid-step with a champagne glass still in hand, stared at the unfolding exposé. The color drained from his face as screen after screen revealed audio of his threats to Portia, screenshots of the messages sent to Brad, and financial trails that traced the bribes and coercion he had used to craft his grand illusion. His fingers tightened around the glass. The smile vanished. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. Portia, who had been holding her breath for weeks, finally exhaled. For too long, she had been trapped between fear and guilt, blackmailed into testifying against Tracy and complicit in a lie she never wanted to tell. Now, with Bard exposing the truth in front of thousands, she no longer had to stay silent. She stepped forward voluntarily, retracting her earlier statement and revealing the full extent of Drew's coercion. Her testimony not only aligned with Bard's evidence but also added new depth, confirming that Drew had orchestrated every piece of the setup, down to the moment Chase arrested Tracy on live television. That was the final blow. The dominoes began to fall. The press, once so eager to crucify Tracy, now redirected their questions with ferocity toward Drew. Officials with the SEC were already reviewing the new evidence, and whispers of obstruction and witness tampering began circulating. Drew, though trying to maintain his composure, looked increasingly like a man watching his empire crumble in slow motion. The applause he'd secretly longed for was replaced with silence and sidelong glances. Port Charles had turned on him. And he wasn't the only one feeling the pressure. Nina, who had once been confident in her ability to manipulate from behind the curtain, found herself thrust under an unforgiving spotlight. Her involvement in Drew's drugging had always been carefully masked, but with Drew exposed, it was only a matter of time before her name surfaced. The pieces were already aligning. Her connection to Jacinda, the operative she'd hired to slip the ketamine into Drew's drink, was a secret that now felt dangerously vulnerable. She had believed she could use Drew as both an ally and a scapegoat, but now that he was falling, she knew he might try to take her with him. Panic crept in behind her carefully composed facade. She had underestimated just how far this would spiral. Meanwhile, the one person still clinging to a thread of hope for Drew, Willow, watched in growing horror. Her trust in Drew had been fragile to begin with, mended over time with quiet conversations and shared regrets. But now, that bond was unraveling. She had defended him, even loved him, but each new revelation widened the gap between them. The man standing in the spotlight wasn't the man she thought she knew. He had lied, manipulated, and destroyed without remorse. The doubt that took root in her mind quickly grew, feeding on the betrayal she could no longer ignore. Her heart ached with the realization that everything she believed might have been a lie. What remained in the wake of Bard's bombshell was ruin, emotional, political, and legal. Drew's allies began distancing themselves. Those who had once stood beside him now refused to meet his gaze. His world, once tightly controlled, collapsed in the span of a single evening. And amid the ashes, Tracy's name was spoken with reverence once again, not as a criminal, but as a survivor of a ruthless attack. She had been dragged through the mud, but the truth had risen like a phoenix, burning away every lie laid at her feet. The nurses' ball, once a night of celebration and unity, ended not with confetti and champagne, but with scandal, resignations, and a deep sense of reckoning. And though the music played on for those still able to dance, the memory of what unfolded that night would echo through the halls of Port Charles for years to come. Tracy, once vindicated, did not storm out of the police station with grand declarations or triumphant gloating. Instead, she exited with a quiet dignity that carried more weight than any outburst ever could. There was a stillness to her, a composed restraint that spoke volumes. She knew the power of silence when the truth had already made the loudest statement. She didn't need to scream her innocence. The city now whispered it with every headline, every social media post, every shaken glance from those who once doubted her. She let the scandal burn without adding fuel, watching from the sidelines as the very man who had sought to destroy her began to fall apart under the weight of his own deceit. Backed by Isaiah's methodical investigation and Bard's devastating testimony, the tide had turned completely in her favor. And as the Securities and Exchange Commission opened a formal investigation into Drew's activities, the possibility of him facing prison again loomed larger than ever. Only this time, there would be no allies to shield him, no technicality to escape on. He had overplayed his hand, and now he was out of moves. The balance of power in Port Charles, once held so tightly by a handful of titans, was now unraveling. What had seemed like an exclusive elite had become a battlefield riddled with betrayal, fear, and unraveling alliances. Tracy's redemption was not just a personal victory, it was a recalibration of the city's political and social order. In outmaneuvering Drew, she hadn't just defended herself, she had dismantled an entire network of manipulation. Portia, once a respected physician, was now publicly grappling with her complicity. Nina, whose ambition had always teetered on the edge of moral compromise, found herself facing legal peril as whispers of her role in the ketamine plot grew louder. Brad, ever the opportunist, now had nowhere left to hide. Their reputations, once burnished and respected, were crumbling as the truth surfaced, unstoppable and unforgiving. Nurses' Ball, intended to be a night of charity, elegance, and celebration, had instead exposed the darkest truths of those who dared play God with others' lives. The ballroom that had once been filled with laughter and orchestral music now echoed with uncomfortable silences and careful conversations. The glittering gowns and tuxedos could no longer mask the rot that had been revealed beneath the surface of Port Charles society. In a city so deeply entrenched in legacy and power, the scandal surrounding Drew's scheme sent tremors through every institution, GH hospital, local law enforcement, even city council chambers. Trust became currency no one could afford to spend. Eyes that once sparkled with admiration now narrowed with suspicion. The lines between victim and villain blurred as revelations continued to pour in. And at the center of it all was Tracy, no longer the scapegoat, but the survivor who had outplayed them all. She had not only escaped ruin, she had engineered the downfall of a man who believed himself untouchable. And yet, this was only the beginning. What unfolded at the nurses' ball was not the end of a scandal, but the first crack in a dam holding back years of buried secrets. With Drew's empire crumbling, it was only a matter of time before others who had benefited from his rise faced their own reckoning. Tracy, ever the strategist, understood this. She didn't need revenge, the dominoes were already falling. Port Charles was now on edge, bracing for aftershocks. As reporters dug deeper and authorities closed in on multiple fronts, a new storm was brewing, one that would test alliances, unearth long-forgotten betrayals, and possibly rewrite the future of every major player in town. And as the clouds gathered over Port Charles, only one thing was certain: the war for power, legacy, and truth had only just begun.